Thank you all for waking up early. Okay, I did something interesting, I guess. Yeah. So today I'm, as has been mentioned, I'm the current president of AAAI, I believe, until July. And today I get to talk to you, and I wanted to talk about challenges of human-aware AI systems. So, of course, this is AAAI, and this is presidential address. These are serious matters. It's a very somber occasion, as you can see from our opening ceremony itself. We are really serious set of people. So let's get started. Those of you who have highly suggestible memories might remember that when I ran for presidency 4 years back, I ran on the platform of MIGA, which is Make AI Great Again. In fact, I was just looking at my the old stuff. I even found my hat that I was giving out as the campaign swag. So it seems to me that I may have delivered on my campaign promises. Maybe it's a little too early to say mission accomplished. I still have 6 more months, but if you at all look at the news, or if you did the mistake that I did, which is actually letting Google send you news tracking articles about AI, then you know that there's just so much that's going on about AI. People are talking a lot about artificial intelligence and its impacts. In fact, Andrew Ng called AI the new electricity, not to be left behind. Sundar Pichai said that AI is bigger than fire and electricity. And then, of course, Tony Lewandowski, who has a lot of time on his hands, said AI is God. We have a church for AI. AI is in every possible consumer item. The one that I really like is the smart electronic toothbrush that apparently uses artificial intelligence algorithms to detect brushing effectiveness in 16 zones of my mouth. I really hope that its values are going to be aligned with my teeth. So, of course, not everything is fine and dandy. There is also some concerns, small concerns that have been expressed about AI. Elon, of course, thinks in his spare time that AI is a bigger threat than North Korea. AI will start the Third World War. The renowned Stephen Hawking said AI could be the worst event in the history of human civilization. And Elon felt he shouldn't be left behind and said AI will likely destroy the humans anyway. So things are going well in AI, right? And we are all basically set to jump, and those of you who know jumping the shark, to the stratosphere very soon. The kinds of advertisements about AI and the media about AI that I particularly like is this sort of things that I came across the other day. This big breaking news about AI is helping old lady cross the street, and apparently this AI also plays with kids, cooks food, hangs around, sans drama. Now, those of you who are wondering how come I didn't get this news article, that's because it's fake news. I just made it up. So the question that I would like to talk to you about really is, why is this fake news? Robert Kennedy said some people look at the world that is there and ask why, and I look at the world that's not there and why not. And so why isn't it that we are talking a lot more about human-aware artificial intelligence systems? Why aren't we doing research on them? Why isn't the world at large thinking more about all these great beneficial applications, including in particular with humans in the loop? And human-aware AI. So that's really the objective of my talk. So I would like to get you through these 4 pieces. One, I'll just spend some time about talking about why isn't human-aware AI all over the place already. Then, and say something about why we should pursue it. In particular, I'll try to bring up some of the worries that were associated with having humans along with AI systems, bring them up in front of us, and then say, look, in fact, the time has changed, and in fact, working with humans will broaden the research challenges of artificial intelligence. And then in this third part, which is actually a pretty big part, the longer part of this talk, I will spend talking about some of the research challenges in human-aware AI. And since I'm most familiar with the work that we've been doing in my own group, I will use that as the case study to talk go into details about some of the challenges. And then I will end with some long-term issues. In fact, it turns out that just having humans in the loop doesn't necessarily mean that it's all fine and dandy. In fact, mental modeling others is essentially the way we can use to cooperate as well as sabotage them. And so we should be interested in the kinds of ethical dilemmas that human-aware AI presents. And I'll talk about that and then hopefully end the talk in time. Okay, so AI's, so the first question I was trying to ask is, why isn't AI from the get-go working with humans? Why was it that there was this whole issue of replacement versus augmentation schism? It turns out that AI has had a rather curious ambivalence to humans. It turns out our systems are happiest either far away from humans. In fact, I don't know if those of you who saw this nice NASA thing coming out today about the beautiful Martian landscape that Spirit and Rover are still hanging about on, or we take a lot of pride whenever we cream the poor humans in yet another thing. So we took pride in winning in chess, and then winning in poker, and of course also winning in Go. It's almost as if the most obvious things that we are doing is kind of either going far away from the humans, or sort of working in opposition with it as a community. So if you're an outsider, are you thinking, is AI technology something that as evil, as worrisome as some of these doomsayers are saying? We aren't necessarily helping our own case to some extent. I sometimes think of this John Lennon saying that we want to help humanity. Apparently, it's the people we cannot really stand. At least that's the way it's been. So what happened to the coexistence from the beginning of the field? We talked about advice takers of McCarthy. Janet Kalodner in her case-based reasoning book said, everyone wants a good housewife. Essentially a personal assistant that helps in all sorts of things. And of course, even Dave's HAAL, which, if you remove that sinister voice, it's a great human-in-the-loop, AI system. So why aren't we doing human-aware AI? I would like to point out that part of the reason is that there is this worry that this might be cheating. It's important to actually bring it out and sort of look at it in its face. From the beginnings, after all, putting human in the loop was seen as maybe it will dilute the goals of AI, or maybe it's a way you cheat the AI system, basically showing capabilities that you don't actually have. The so-called prestidigitation is behind, of course, the mechanical Turk of the old, where in fact it had a nice little Turk sitting inside the machine, and that's basically the back side of the intelligence. Or if you are into that, the more recent mechanical South, the so-called Sophia robot, which basically, again, there's a lot of question as to whether, in fact, there is cheating involved, when you have humans in the loop. Thus, that thought of a worry was there. In fact, in talking about artificial intelligence to general audience, that I seem to get to do a lot, because suddenly we apparently are, everybody is interested in figuring out what AI is doing. I find that useful to point out that among the many types of intelligences, the perceptual intelligence, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and cognitive intelligence, humans, basically human babies, seem to be going from the perceptual to the emotional, to the social, to cognitive. And the AI systems, at least in the way they have developed, actually went from cognitive tasks. For example, we were able to do expert systems and chess, and then more recently we are doing perceptual intelligence and manipulation intelligence. In between was this emotional and social intelligence, and that has sort of become the Rodney Dangerfield of AI, in the sense it doesn't get that much of a respect. Somehow it was not seen as something directly connected to the goals of AI. However, I would like to actually argue in the time I have that in fact HAAI expands the reach and scope of the AI enterprise. After all, there is the evolutionary theories that tell us that we needed the huge brains that we have not to run away from the tigers of Bengal or the lions of Savannah, but to reason about each other's mental states. We are continually, constantly monitoring each other and figuring out how to interact with each other, either cooperatively or competitively. So this is really AI writ large, and if you remove that, essentially you're losing half of the picture. That's what I would like to argue. Of course, some of you here already know that, are probably from fields like intelligent tutoring systems or social robotics, two areas which actually have very strongly taken human in the loop seriously, because after all, intelligent tutoring systems don't make any sense at all if you don't have humans in the loop. Who are you tutoring? So there's been a lot of nice work done there, in particular by pioneers such as Kurt von Lehn, my colleague at Arizona State University, and also in social robotics, Cynthia Brazil, Brian Scasalati. There's great work there. But one of the points that I want to get across to you is human-aware AI is not just for these heart-tugging applications where there is, you're teaching somebody or you're trying to help like an autistic kid. It's really quotidian applications. Pretty much anywhere AI systems come anywhere near contact with humans, you need to have the ability to support the challenges of human-aware AI. In particular, you want to support assistants, human-aware digital personal assistants, and human-aware office and hospital assistants. So in fact, and then also in teaming, you could either have elbow-to-elbow sort of teaming in factory floors, or remote and cognitive kinds of teaming involving, for example, in the search and rescue scenarios, or mixed initiative or cooperative planning decision-making scenarios. This actually, different people have different holy grails. To me, for those of you old enough, you might remember this guy, Corporal Radar from MASH. To me, Corporal Radar from MASH, an AI version of that, is one of the holy grails, because this is a guy who's this amazingly great assistant who would know what the boss wants before the boss even starts thinking about it, and is able to help. And so those are things that are very useful applications. Increasingly, in fact, I think human-computer interaction has sort of been a separate field, but if everything is AI, really we will be thinking more in terms of human-AI interaction. There are humongous challenges there, and that will essentially come back to our field to some extent. Of course, I'm not the only one to start worrying about this, start talking about it. Barbara Gross, who gave the 1994 presidential address, actually talked about essentially again the collaborative systems and human-in-the-loop systems, and she's been actually making a lot of evangelization on that whole direction. On my side too, back in 16 when we ran IJCAI, the special theme was a human-aware AI, the idea being why intentionally design a dystopian future and spend time being all paranoid about it. I'm very happy that this AAAI has a special track on human-AI collaboration, and that there are a bunch of interesting talks again through the conference, that we are taking this seriously. Of course, the research agencies are also taking them seriously. This is a JSON report that talks about human-aware AI, and the Obama National Research Initiative also talked about human-aware AI and the importance of supporting that there. I'm on the board of directors of Partnership for AI, and they look at collaborations between people and AI systems as one of the 7 thematic pillars. So again, there's more interest that's being shown here. So the good news is I'm already done with those 2 bullets at this point. The bad news is that the third bullet is a really big bullet. So that's the research challenges that I want to talk about a little, in particular from the point of view of planning and decision making, which happens to be the area that I have spent my career in. And before I get there, however, let me show my colleagues, because inevitably I'll probably run out of time and I'll be thrown out of the stage. So it's a good time to show my colleagues here, including my students and my robots, of course, and some of my external colleagues, Matthias Schwitz, Nancy Cook, and Hansi on his work. Okay, so let me start with planning specific view of human-aware artificial intelligence and what are the challenges planning and decision-making bring there. In particular, we look at this very happy intelligent agent architecture that most of you have seen, of course, in the Intro to AI courses. Either you taught them or you took them. And the entire point of AI as a planning guy, to me is the million-dollar question is, given the information that I'm able to get out of the environment and the modeling I'm able to do of the environment, what's my next action going to be? So that's actually involves planning. And of course, planning community has spent, in different parts, has spent significant effort in essentially coming up with efficient algorithms for making these kinds of decisions. My own research essentially has one important thing to notice here is when we talk about environment, we don't differentiate between the inanimate environment or environment with people. So it's basically you're not necessarily differentiating and modeling the humans in the environment. So much of my own work, let's say until about a decade back, essentially has focused on these directions. We looked at increasingly more expressive models and supporting planning in them, as well as increasingly more different types of goals that the humans could have, the users could have, and how to support them in planning. And then towards the end, specifically looking at models that are incomplete or incorrectly specified and how to support robust planning in that. This last part reminds me of the very nice talk that Tom Dietrich did 2 years back on robust artificial intelligence in open worlds. In particular, when you have domains which are incomplete, then models will be incomplete, and so actually generating plans there winds up being much costlier than generating plan in a completely known domain. So this was the direction that we've been working in the back. The moment you actually introduce humans in the loop and actually directly model them, so once you start modeling the human's mental state, which winds up being one of the more important things, in addition to the physical state, in addition to seeing humans as just obstacles that you need to get around, you also want to essentially realize that they have beliefs, desires, and intentions, and you are trying to make your decision making in the context of that particular sorts of model. The moment you do that, it's clear to see that pretty much every part of this intelligent agent architecture will change. In particular, the state information now includes the human mental model, and when you do something, when you have background knowledge, it's not just about how the world evolves, but how the human's mental states evolve. So people tend to get bored. That's, for example, persistence of attention is not guaranteed. What is my action going to do to the world was the original question. Now you'll say, what's my action going to do to the people's mental state? So if I start jumping up and down on this state, on this stage, in addition to falling down, I also do things to your mental models of what's going on right now here. And then, of course, in addition to looking at your own goal, the AI system's goal, you want to keep track of the human's goals and decide whether to compete or cooperate with them. And that changes, of course, the reasoning parts too. State estimation, what the world is right now, will also involve what is the human intentions goals. You have to keep track of that. And what happens when I do an action? You also have to consider what happens when I do an action to the human's mental model. And using those, you have to make the decision of what's my next action going to be. So the planning now becomes, I would like to think of it as human-aware planning, which involves keeping track of these mental models. We looked at some of the challenges, the broad challenges that come up in this kind of a general situation, and we wrote like a survey paper that's out there on the web, but I won't go into too much details on that. Instead, I want to focus on two specific things, really. The primary challenge is modeling and reasoning with human mental models, specifically modeling and managing the human's mental state, which involves, of course, intention recognition and intention projection. I will say something about it, but it's also had received some attention in the past. And then a second part, which is quite novel, quite important, is it's not just enough to model human's mental state. You want to model human's mental state of yourself. So the AI system needs to understand what does the human think of its capabilities, its current goals, and its current state. And that winds up changing the way the system has to behave in the presence of the human, in particular, how to show explicable behavior, how to behave in such a way that people don't get spooked, how to provide explanations when you can't behave in an explicable way, as I will point out, showing explicable behavior oftentimes can be costly for the agent. Doing what people expect you to do can be costlier than doing your own thing, because that might be less optimal. And so, however, if you want to do your own thing, then you should be able to explain. And the explanations have received a lot of interest in AI. But as I'll point out, much of it has been explanations with respect to the inscrutable representations, which involves pointing, saying this is what I want, this is what I want. But really, explanation is much bigger than that. We use that as a dialogue for collaboration between human agents, and we want to support that between human and AI agents too. And then, of course, you can combine explicability and explanation. Now, I would go into details of these mental models and how we actually, use them in planning. But before that, I want to mention one interesting part, in fact, of the working in these kinds of areas, which is that, in the beginnings of AI, and when I was a grad student, I used to read as many papers in cognitive science as I would in artificial intelligence. We are a much more interdisciplinary field earlier on. We become, obviously for good reasons, become much more focused in specific directions. But bringing humans into AI systems really makes it again an interdisciplinary endeavor. I tend to think that a bunch of engineers trying to decide what humans want is a bit of an oxymoron, if you get my drift. So there are really a large number of, there are areas that actually spend their life, thinking about human factors and, how, studying human teams, and not taking those into account has caused all sorts of things, even within AI, whether now or before. For example, Tesla apparently thinks that you can completely ignore what's going on and come back to attention in a split second, and tell that to that poor guy who went under the white truck. It's very hard for people to change their attention that fast. And of course, the lovable paperclip has actually shown that, in fact, we need to have better models of humans, and that has actually changed an entire research direction in Microsoft. I mean, Eric Harvich, my friend, yells at me anytime I show a paperclip. I do want to point out that after starting that direction, paperclip, I think that the story was that when paperclip was retired, everybody stood up and clapped. But it also started an entirely different direction of research, which actually started taking human factors into account. In my own case, I work in our group, we closely collaborate with Nancy Cook, who is a researcher in human factors. She actually is a past president of Human Factors Society, and she has done her life's work on understanding how human teams work. And we basically have this interdisciplinary approach where she will work with human teams, and we take those lessons, try to make algorithms, we then go back and study them in terms of human studies. To give you like a little glimpse of that, several years back, even before this became a thing and we started having Minecraft-based AI gyms and so on, we actually wound up using Minecraft as a simulated environment where two humans, essentially, Wizard of Oz studies, these are called, where a human and another human who is playing the role of an AI system will try to interact and try to team and do a collaborative task. And then Nancy and her team will study this to understand the teaming effectiveness and what sorts of things seem to be important, what are not. So, for example, they will have these kinds of dyads. There is an internal and an external. The external commander will essentially be telling the internal robot system, in this particular case another human, and she would study their dialogues and see what sorts of interactions are happening. And here is like a snippet of results from her studies. For example, they find that dyads using natural language and shared mental models do show more stable behavior. And furthermore, when robot is unaware of operator's challenges, operator perceives higher mental load. When you say operator here, that's humans in the loop. So, in fact, one of the things that we have in AI have to understand is assistants. Just an assistant, having an assistant doesn't necessarily make your life easy. Having a clueless assistant makes your life harder. and if they don't keep track of your mental state, your mental workload actually increases. This is part of the reason why some of us probably don't have secretaries, because it's a harder thing to deal with. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this up to say that this is how we are not just sitting and trying to think because we are humans, let's just introspect and say what humans want. That's, as they say, introspection is the worst form of psychology. It probably is also worst form of human-aware artificial intelligence research. So you do have to have these interdisciplinary collaborations. So coming back to our work based on that sort of a collaboration, teaming requires modeling the human, of course. And then so in some sense, the AI system should have some sort of a theory of mind, should understand that the humans in the loop have their own goals and they have emotional responses and so on. And then use that information to, recognize the intentions of the humans. What are they trying to achieve right now? This could be based on dialogue. This could be based on essentially, of course, visual input, based on monitoring of the humans. So what are they trying to achieve? And use that to provide proactive support. So based on if you're trying to do a goal, then the agent can actually help you. The planning agent can help you by the robotic agent can help you by satisfying that goal part way so that you can wind up doing the rest of it. There are papers on that in AMAS 2016, for example, in HRI conferences, NIRAS, sorts of places. And then intention projection. One of the other things is the AI systems are the robots. When I say, by the way, AI systems, we'll talk about robots, because those make the more cute videos, but it's actually any AI systems. I'll also show you like a mixed initiative planning system where the humans are trying to make plans, author the plans, and the AI system is in the background trying to help improve their plan authoring. Okay, so either of them wind up requiring intention recognition, and the system, AI system, should be able to project its intentions. What am I going to do? Just as we show our intentions by either wearing them on our face or doing the dialogue, AI systems also should be able to do that. And of course, this is also studied. So there's work that we have done here too. One thing that is interesting when you have robots instead of humans and humans is, I don't know if you noticed or not, one thing that is still missing, I guess unless Elon Musk's Neuralink project takes off, is we don't have USB connections. We don't essentially interact with each other by just connecting our brains. And so to some extent, basically, we wind up having this more indirect ways of recognizing intentions and recognizing projecting intentions. With the AI systems, in certain narrow cases, we can actually use some of the newer technologies. So for example, you might have brain-computer interfaces, even like the simplest ones. In this particular case, in our lab, we were using this like an emotive interface, which basically looks at some brain activity to actually see at least what directions you are pointing at, and that could help the AI system provide better support. So in this case, I don't know if you're noticing this one. This guy is very happy because he's looking at saying one of these blocks is mine, don't touch that. And without saying it, in fact, the machine was able to recognize that. And when that happens, he goes back saying, wow, I made it. So that sort of a thing is possible, of course. Intention projection is also possible. Of interesting ways of direct ways of projecting intentions are possible with things like Hololens. So there, either the robot can essentially, in our work, we will have the robot essentially directly project into the visual field of the human some of its goals. So there's additional information. And also allow the human to directly manipulate the objects in this virtual space. That reduces, for example, the need for natural language dialogue. So these are things that are actually possible because we're talking about the humans and machines interacting rather than humans and humans interacting. That's about the intention projection. Anyway, this particular thing actually the students went to the Microsoft Imagine Cup World Finals, I think US Finals, and it was fun. So now that gets me to the second part of our research, which I said is the more novel part, which is teaming not only requires keeping track of the human's model about what do they want to do, but it also requires modeling the human's model of you. So if you are getting confused, just realize that in this picture, the robot essentially has a particular model MR, and the human has a different model of the same task, MH. And it's this model differences that cause most of the interesting conflicts in collaborative work. So if the robot and human have different models of the same task, the consequence is that plans that are optimal to the robot may not be optimal to the human, because they are thinking of the task in a different model. Okay, so when that happens, the robot now has, or the AI system now has, two different options. It can just do explicable planning. If it has kept track of the human's model of the task, it can just do the behavior that will be optimal with respect to the human's model rather than the one that's optimal with respect to it. Okay, that's the explicable planning. If you do what people expect you to do, you don't have to say anything, as you know. The other is explanations, which is it turns out that, as we'll see in a minute, explicable planning winds up taking additional resources in terms of essentially doing something that's optimal with respect to another model means it's actually maybe inoptimal with respect to your model. And if you want to avoid that cost, you would actually do what is costly, what is optimal with respect to your model, but be ready to explain why the behavior you're showing is different from what the human in the loop would be expecting. And that will require explanations, and explanations in this case will wind up resolving the perceived suboptimality by revealing the differences, the specific differences between the models. So the robot essentially has to point out, these are the things that are different in your model because of which you are surprised at my behavior. So this is quite different from the normal way of explaining by putting a little circle around a picture saying this is where the cat is, because those are sort of debugging explanations. Here, explanation is really always about the other person's mind. It's about their other person's model, and that winds up being important. So in the case of explicability, human-aware planning problem is essentially can be thought of essentially as two models. It's a multi-model planning. It's two different models, one that the robot has of the task, other that human has of the task and other robot. And in this case, you're trying to generate a plan pi such that that plan is executable in the robot's model. It better be actually executable at least, but it is really close to optimal in the human's model. So it's a funny thing where you are doing behavior that you know is suboptimal with respect to your model, but you know that it makes the human happy. Those of you who have spouses know that that's a good way to live life. You do things that you are expected to do, especially if you are a male, then you think that talking is kind of costly, I'm told, and so it's actually better to just do what you're expected to do, then you don't have to explain anything. Okay, so explicability should be actually, is the thing that the robots will do to actually show the behavior that is close to what is expected. Then, so to give you a sense in this scenario, so in this kind of a scenario, we have a map of our fifth floor building in computer science department back in Arizona State University. And we're using this as like a stand-in for some sort of an mock urban search and rescue scenario. So there is the map of this environment is available up front to both the robot and the human in the loop. Human is outside, but there may be additional changes that are happening on the setting scenario, especially in places where there are actually in urban search and rescue kind of scenarios, there may be pathways that might be closed. So that's exactly what happens here. Instead of boulders falling on a path, there's a particular path that is obstructed, and you'll see in this case, if this video works, that the robot basically reasons that rather than take the shorter path, given that a particular area right now, that area is blocked, rather than take the next shorter path, it just tries to remove this obstacle, basically sub-goal on making this path feasible, because if it does that and if it goes this way, then it doesn't have to explain, because this would also be the optimal behavior with respect to the model that the human has of the environment. So that's the kind of thing you can wind up doing if you'll wind up having to do in terms of explicable planning. And as I said, it requires dealing with two different models, your own model and the model that you have approximated of the human's task. Okay, and of course, from the point of view of sort of a decision making, it's an optimization task where you're not only minimizing the cost of your plan in some, but you're also minimizing the distance of your plan to the plan that the human expects you will have, the plan or the behavior that the human expects you will have. And if there are scenarios like the one that I showed you where actually both the models are available, if the setting is such that at least, for example, the beginning part of the model is available for both of them, there may be scenarios where actually you have to learn the human's model. What do they think of this task indirectly? And that makes the problem more interesting, obviously, because you now have to not only learn about the world, you have to learn about the human's model of the world that you are together living in. So if your robot doesn't have access to the human's expectation model, then you have to learn it. One obvious thing, of course, is to just sort of sub-goal this into, I'll spend some time trying to figure out the human's model of the task. I'll say in a minute that in doing so, you may very well want to consider planning models that are much shallower than the system itself is using, because it's a question of sample complexity. If you don't have enough samples of behavior from the human, then learning a model which has full actions with preconditions and effects will wind up overfitting to the data. I'll show you examples of that in a minute. So in this particular case, actually this is a paper from ICRA 2017, we wind up approximating the human's model of the world as a labeling process. So we have this model that humans look at a behavior and say it makes sense because this part corresponds to this task, this parts correspond to this task. So the actions are labeled saying they are corresponding to some high-level tasks. And if you're able to label this sequence, then it is explicable, otherwise it's not. If you use that as the approximation, then during the search, the robot essentially can, or the AI system can essentially not only consider the cost of the partial plan, but also consider whether it is labelable currently based on the labeling process that you learned. And the labeling process itself, in that particular paper, we learned it using essentially starting from a bunch of traces and having using training data which involve essentially human subjects saying these pieces make sense because of this labeling, and then learning a CRF model there. But you could be using other techniques. For example, we have also later on used bidirectional LSTMs, which wound up actually showing better performance. But again, that sort of brings up this issue that underneath the hood, you now have a bigger learning problem, which is not only are you learning about the world, you are now learning about the humans' models of the world, which actually involves, of course, setting up, places where we can collect feedback from the human subjects. And so we, there are other people doing this sort of thing too, but we collected human labels from, for the kind of data that for the behaviors that we are looking at through a web interface, and then use that trace data to do our learning of the model. Here I want to make a small detour into the learning side and point out that there is a very interesting connection here. AI has obviously been sort of split between causal and interpretable models that somebody writes because they understood the world and they wrote the model for you. Planning community, for example, has used causal models. So in fact, they have actions with preconditions and effects, and that sort of is a complete model of the world. To the associative models where all you know is if this action happens, then after a while this other action happens, because by expectation you have seen them happening in the traces that you have found. And planning community typically hasn't looked at associational models, but when we started looking at this problem of learning the models, we quickly realized, obviously, that learning shallow models sometimes is much more preferable because you don't have as much data available. And in fact, we have shown, that given the same amount of data, actually one other point that, and then when you start using the shallow models in planning community, I kind of think that's an interesting way machine learning and planning are kind of coming to the middle, because machine learning side, you're going from correlational models to come towards causal models, and people in planning community have basically assumed that there are human hand-coded causal models, and then you have to learn to live with correlational models. Having said that, I should also mention that, remember, the learning is important of the models, but there are also settings where in fact the models are available. If, for example, in my setting where the map of the environment is available for both human and the robot. I just want to point out that when there is the same amount of data, sometimes learning the shallow model would actually wind up being useful even for simple planning tasks, whether or not there are humans in the loop. So this was some work that was presented in 2016, which showed that doing like word vector style models, essentially completely correlational models from the amount of behavioral data you have, leads to better performance on the end task of plan recognition than learning the full strips model and then using that to do plan recognition. And what happens in that later case is essentially you are overfitting to the data because you don't have enough data. So that's sort of an interesting side to the learning part. And then we talked about explicability, which is doing your behavior such that it is closer to what the human expects. Now I want to talk about explanations, which is the other side of the coin, where you want to do what is better for you, the AI system does behavior that's optimal for it, but it tries to explain to the human why they shouldn't be mad at it. Okay, why should they understand this behavior? This understanding can be thought of in terms of a reconciliation of the models. The human has a model of the task, and obviously explanation typically involves explanatory dialogue, and something has to be driving this dialogue. And the thing that will be driving the dialogue is this model reconciliation, the changes between the model that the AI system has of the world and the human has of the world. Now, in this particular case, when there are these two models, even though I'm looking at these collaborative scenarios and cooperative problem-solving scenarios, this sort of thing also occurs, of course, in tutoring systems where, in fact, maybe the student's model is faulty and the teacher has a better model. So I'm not making a claim as to who is the teacher, who is the student. Whenever you do a behavior that is not making sense to the human in the loop, you need to provide an explanation that is best seen in terms of this model reconciliation. And the reconciliation essentially involves saying, please add these epsilons to your model, these changes to your model. In our case, we look at precondition effect models, in strips formalisms, and add this epsilon, these additional preconditions or additional effects to the actions, such that if you do that, then you too would have seen that the behavior I am doing is the right behavior. Okay, so after that, the plan that I am doing will also be optimal with respect to your modified model. Okay, so explanations as model reconciliation is this approach that I'll talk a little more about, but I also want to point out that XAA is, of course, hard. I think we talk about explanation of explainability of AI systems a lot, but mostly as a debugging tool, essentially, for people to understand why systems with inscrutable representations are making fail in ways that you can't understand. So if I show an image of a school bus and an image recognition system says, ostrich, then I say, show me the ostrich in the picture, and then it'll put some little circle around some part, presumably. But that is only one type of explanations, maybe the kind of the poor man's explanations to some extent, because we are stuck with inscrutable representations there. Explanations are also critical for collaboration, and in those cases, it's not the agent just talking to itself, saying it makes sense to me. No, I did this because it makes sense to me in this following proof. I gave it to myself, so you shouldn't complain. Okay, that just never works when you have teams, right? So explanations are always in terms of the others model, and model reconciliation view hews close to even psychological theories on explanations that humans do. For example, there's a great work and also summarized by Tanya Lambrazo, who actually talks about a variety of properties of human explanations, including contrastive property, which is sort of saying, why did you do this as against something else? And this something else, if you don't provide a foil, something else is the optimal plan I would have come up with. If I provide a foil, then I say, why didn't you do this? Which actually winds up being simpler, and it is subsumed by this sort of a model reconciliation approach. In work that we presented in HAAL in 2017, we talked about different kinds of explanations that we can talk about, even in this context of PDDL or the strip sorts of models. And I'll make the names here, but I'll show you some examples in a minute. So model patch and plan patch explanation. Model patch explanation essentially is, if somebody says, why did you do this? I don't understand. Then you say, here, take my model, put it in your head. Okay, and that will answer the question. That actually takes the least amount of computational work on the agent's part, but it is humongous amount of communication. You're throwing both relevant and irrelevant information to the human, to the other side. So model patch is easier to compute, but it's actually obviously quite bad thing. And then we want to consider minimal explanations, small explanations that will still let the human understand that this particular plan makes sense. Okay, and then of course there are other kinds of models, and all these models wind up being, if you take in this particular case a robot's model and the human's model of a small task, in this case, a fetch robot, which it turns out, we found this out to our horror, that when fetch tried to move, if it actually keeps its hand extended, it topples. Basically, its center of gravity falls and it topples. And so it looks very strange. If it has to move, then it has to do this contorted operation of actually putting the hand below and then start moving. That winds up making the human in the loop think, why are you doing this? And it's partly because there are additional preconditions that and effects that the robot model has that the human model doesn't have. And these changes, subsets of them will wind up becoming explanations in the explanatory dialogue. And it turns out that these different explanations have very different properties in terms of completeness and also in terms of computability. I pointed out, for example, that giving the entire model, it's a no-brainer in a sense, because you just give the entire model, but you don't have to do much of a computation, but it's a prohibitively expensive communication. And there are other parts in the spectrum. In terms of actually computing this explanation itself, this turns out to be a meta search. This is a search in the space of models themselves, and we show that some structure of this model spaces actually make this search more tractable, and not completely polynomial or anything, but it actually, you can exploit it. In fact, providing explanations is not easy. I mean, I'm sure as humans we know that providing right kind of explanations is not easy, and so this does provide a way you can go towards computing them. So in this second part of that same video, it just looked and saw that path was blocked and just went on its merry way. If I had the volume on, you would hear it, yelling this explanation multiple times, saying, I'm doing this because this particular path is blocked. Okay, so that's what is explanation. And you can actually also trade explicability and explanation, which is a reasonable thing to do. So rather than do exactly what people expect or do what is best for you, you go halfway. So that too can be formalized in the model we have, where in essence you change the human's model partway and then do your behavior that's optimal in this middle model. And that turns out actually is doable, and it provides a way of reducing communication versus optimality of behavior. I want to just show you like an example of that with the videos running in the back, but I mostly want to focus on this other one to just show that we do this work. Although I showed the robot pictures, we do this also in the context of essentially interfaces. This particular interface is with a NASA project where essentially the human is trying to make, human mission planners are trying to make mission plans. If we found out, as you probably might know, if you have seen Hidden Figures, computers used to be humans. In NASA, for a large, even now, mission planners, planner means a human, and they actually have expertise about how to put these mission plans together, and then you want to help them, and that basically would involve essentially providing this sort of a planning support which keeps track of their intentions and provides the right kinds of explanations. So that is also being done on the side. Now, one thing that, when I do these sorts of computation of explanations, etc., I would like to now say, are we in the right direction? Is this working? So let's just ask humans. That's where those of you who ever heard, let's ask humans, heard this big bang saying IRB. IRB, of course, is the Institutional Review Board, basically, which has to look at what sort of studies you're doing with humans. In fact, if I ask, how many of you in this audience have applied for and have IRBs? That's good, but obviously not enough. Really, if AI people want to say we like humans, it's hard to say we like humans, but we don't want IRBs, okay? Because we really are not taking into account the impacts of the work we are doing, the experimentation we are doing, and so we are not considering experimenting with human subjects and following the procedures. So it should become really a household name for people interested in AI. And of course, IRB guidelines themselves may have to evolve with advances in the AI technology, and this is a very important ethical issue for the society to deal with. We do have them, thankfully, and so we've done some experiments where essentially we set up the same sort of the explanation scenario, except in a simulator where there is a human can be an internal and the planner is external, or vice versa. And in this particular case, human is the internal and the human is playing the role of the robot, and we had essentially human subjects provide explanations, and the good news is the kinds of explanations they provide wind up corresponding to the kind of explanations that we were considering earlier in the set of explanations. And furthermore, they seem to actually be providing more these minimally complete explanations, for which we made a bigger deal. The other thing is essentially to see if in fact showing explicable behavior is reducing the need for explanations. That in that case we had humans play the externals, and the planner makes the paths, and then the humans can ask for explanations. This is a very interesting setup that my students did. This is gamified. There's a nice paper on that, so that people are incentivized to play this game. And so it turns out actually that explicable plans do reduce the number of times humans ask for explanations. So this sort of comes close to what we were hoping for. There are ways of extending this stuff, of course, this line of research, handling multiple humans and different abstractions. There's a paper that's coming up at ICAPS 2018, where essentially in this particular video, you have two different humans, one external remote, one external in, and they have two different models, and the robot has a third model. And the robot, when it's providing explanations, has to make sense to each of them separately. This should not be surprising. Actually, explanations are very much dependent on who you are giving the explanation to. And then a doctor explains her diagnosis to a colleague in a very different way than she would explain it to a patient. And so the models also can be at different levels of abstraction, and we are working on, this one is being presented in ICAPS, and we are also working on how to deal with the model abstraction levels. So summary of the research that I wanted to present here from our side is, of course, basically to say that human-robot teaming requires a robot to model the human's goals and intentions, but also to model human's model of the robot. Okay, that's the second order is important, and that can be used for explicability and explanations. Okay, so that gets me towards the final stage, basically just two more slides. So the longer term issues about working in this sort of human aware AI involve, for example, trust in issues connected to trust between humans and machines. Trust in autonomy is a pretty big word, and actually a lot of people are interested in basically understanding how to actually engender trust in AI systems, between AI systems and machines. But while we don't understand the complete mechanisms, of course, of how the trust is engendered, the mechanism might be complex, but showing inexplicable behavior certainly reduce your ability to gain trust. So doing crazy things, you will lose trust fast of the humans in the loop. So there certainly steps in the right direction. And so this is something that we are going towards. Part of the interesting point about trust is that we are always making exceptions in a longitudinal behavior. And so one of the newer projects involves taking this into longitudinal interactions between humans and AI systems. And does that make you make exceptions, when you know the robot, for example? This also brings up a whole bunch of new ethical quandaries to human-aware AI and AI research in general. As I mentioned earlier, evolutionarily, mental modeling allowed us to both cooperate and compete and sabotage each other. In fact, lying is possible. I felt very happy when my son was able to tell a lie, because that tells me that my son has a brain, and knows that his model of the world is different from my model of the world. If you don't understand that, you can't lie. Okay, so lying itself is possible because we are actually able to realize this. HAAI systems with mental modeling capabilities bring these quandaries. For example, Jonathan Grach last year did this nice work showing, for example, that you can have negotiating agents that, just like humans, misrepresent their intentions to gain material advantage. When humans do it, it's fair game. When do we want machines to do this, for example? And do we want personal assistants, our personal assistants, to tell us a little white lie just so that we'll eat healthy and have happier life? Or not? Okay, these are very interesting things. So people are always worried about robots coming and bombing us all to smithereens. There's much more subtle ways AI systems can get us, and if you are into these doom and gloom scenarios, at least spend time on these sorts of things. We certainly are. There is a paper there that on mental modeling and acceptable symbiosis in human and AI collaboration that's on arXiv that looks at some of these issues in a preliminary fashion. One thing that's worth mentioning here is humans have these example closure tendencies. When you see a behavior, you think the system can do a lot more things around that, and those seem to be particularly pronounced for emotional and affective systems, and so no one who saw the shaky for the first time thought it could shoot hoops, but the first people who saw Eliza the system thought it was a real Rosarian psychologist. That did make people like Sherry Turkle worry very much about what sort of impacts these robots like Cosmo are going to have on our kids, and that's a very legitimate worry, and we do need to worry about it. So towards completing, human-aware AI brings a slew of additional challenges. I love this quote from Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s first book. If only it weren't for the people, the goddamn people, Finnerty says, always getting tangled up in the machinery. If it weren't for them, Earth would be an engineer's paradise. We're all engineers, and we would like humans to get out of the picture, but some of our best friends are humans. And so we should be interested in dealing with these additional challenges with a happy face. And I want to end with a sort of a positive note. I started by making fun of AI long back. Really, we are all in this room interested in AI, not just because of Google sending tons and tons of news articles every time, but because there really are only three fundamental questions facing our age. Okay? Origin of universe, origin of life, and nature of intelligence. And we get to work on one of them. That's what makes many of us get up with a spring in our step every day. And so that's my bachelor's thesis, and I'm still as happy about AI as I was in 1983 when laser printers apparently weren't invented. So I'll stop there and take your questions if there are any, and if you have time. And this is a summary of talk, and that's a summary of research. Thank you. Yes. Please, yeah, please.
Kobe Gal from Ben Gurion University. Thanks for a great talk. So I'm trying to understand what the big challenges you mentioned. The first one that you focused the complete talk on was on modeling cognitive behavior. Mm-hmm. And then almost offhandedly, you made a few remarks about data, about problems for getting data.
So
my question is, I want to put it to you that the challenges should be flipped, because it's not just a matter of getting data so you can evaluate the accuracy of your measures like in classical machine learning. You're building agents that need to interact with people actively in the world. You need to understand how people respond to machine-generated actions. And for that, you need much more than just obtaining a data set, but actually understanding how people respond to your actions. And I would love to see a much more integrated approach from within the AI community about sharing data and techniques for understanding how people react to machine learning interventions. Yes. And I don't see that yet.
Yes, I think actually, in fact, those were some of those challenges. We are very much aware of it, and I completely agree that those have to be taken into consideration. I didn't focus at all on the learning challenges. We have written about them, and we have seen them in our own experimental data that we are catching. But certainly, I think your point is very well taken. Yes, Barbara.
Oh, can I?
Barbara Gross from Harvard. I want to thank you also for a very interesting talk and for remembering my 1994 talk. The field has come a long way. And for also showing that not only is it compelling to think about building systems that are human aware, but also has a lot of interesting research directions. But I also wanted to say I have a new soapbox now, because thankfully my 1994 soapbox has been taken up by other people. and that's that we have to design ethics into our systems from the beginning.
Yes.
And so you kind of tag that at the end, but I just wanted to ask how you're thinking about ethics as you develop these systems. Because to develop the system, I mean, we've seen this now with Twitter, with fake news, and also with the Taybot and so on, that if you just get a system out there because, gosh, I could do it, it has all sorts of ethical implications that might have been thought about ahead of time.
I completely respect that point of view. Actually, I think that essentially I wanted to bring up that there's a lot of important ethical issues. The question of how do you interleave that with research is something that we are also grappling with. And I think, I've heard, I think you point out that you teach a course where you get people to start thinking at that. Those are great directions to have in mind. But certainly, I think even things like the AI ethics and society was the first time we had this conference, and having this, integrated into the research would be great direction.
So you have a question over here, real quick.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, my name is Brian Ruttenberg from Charles River Analytics. So I'm wondering what the role human bias plays in all of this work, that you're talking about interacting with humans, but humans are not nice, perfect, rational actors. And, do we as a community try and overcome that bias? Do we deal with it? Do we just reinforce it and give up? I'm just curious where you feel that fits in.
So first of all, the fact that humans have biases comes up in all our studies, in the human team studies, for example. So people who are external and are supposed to just provide suggestions will be, if they are micromanagers, they will actually try to manage the team member inside. We see this. At this point, we haven't come to the point where we have specific things to say about how to manage those biases, but I did talk about some of these coming up as ethical issues we have to worry about.
Thanks.
So this is Ning Wang from University of Southern California.
Okay.
Here. So you talked about trust in AI systems, and of course that if AI systems never make any mistakes, we probably don't have any problem trust them. So inevitably we will make mistakes because optimal behavior doesn't mean that it's always correct.
Yeah.
So what do you think the AI system should do in that case?
I think my point is essentially to say that we shouldn't just be worried about robots coming at us with guns, but also basically sometimes doing things. I mean, as I was trying to point out in that picture, there is a beautiful movie called Sting, which involves essentially, modifying mental models such that in the end you can use it against people. And we have to start worrying about how are we going to deal with those sorts of issues. I'm not saying that I actually don't at all think that trust is a unary issue. I'm just saying, if you want to engender it, it's a longitudinal thing. But after you engender the trust, then it can be misused. And we have to start thinking about that, just as much as safety issues in AI.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. I won't claim to have done as much systematic search of this as you, but my experience working with people in AI systems is that the harder problem is the dynamic interaction. So you ask a question, you get an answer, you don't like it, you get a new answer, and it's a mystery how you went from one to the other. As I thought more about that, I thought that part of this relates to an implicit assumption you're making, which is that the models are different in content, but are the same in kind,
yes,
and that the reasoning process is of the same nature, which finally leads to one more thing, which is maybe it's the wrong thing to look at, at human-human teaming. I mean, maybe we're looking at
yes,
human-human teaming, but we're trying to design human-dog teams.
No, actually, there's 2 points, and of course, we are supposed to end this session right away. But so the 2 points are: one, the human teaming studies were very carefully designed to reduce this general dialogue. So in fact, in that slide, we talk about limiting the language so that there's only certain kinds of explanations that people can use. And I do think this is the first step. I am no longer, the press will have you believe that AI systems are already here at the human level intelligence. I'm not at all saying that's the case. These are the kinds of problems we should be talking about. And I'm told that we are already run out of time. So I'd be happy to take any questions outside. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank Rao for a fascinating talk. Please join me in thanking him once again.